Hello, this is Ian Lohr, and welcome to Money Culture. Today we'll be continuing our talk about modern economics with a discussion of globalism. Since the economy of a nation is the sum total of all business, this can be represented by figures such as the gross national product or gross domestic product, there are essentially two approaches to promoting growth overall: the old way and the new way. The old way is known as protectionism. A nation following protectionist policies concentrates on its own eternal economy with little or no regard for the economic situation of other nations. This is done by subsidizing domestic industry, discouraging foreign companies from providing goods and services in competition with domestic companies, encouraging unequal trade arrangements, and engaging in aggressive international competition for resources and markets. There are many ways to discourage foreign operations, including high tariffs, import quotas, high customs duties, excessive taxes, and other barriers to trade. This type of system, repeated worldwide, with each nation in perpetual economic conflict with other nations, produced some less than favorable results. For example, unresolved trade disputes contributed significantly to the tensions that produced 2 world wars before the middle of the last century. In the aftermath of the second of these wars, economists and political theorists began to advance an idea just as radical as capitalism, that nations could lay the groundwork for lasting peace and mutual prosperity by tying their economies closer together. Up until that time, most nations were relatively isolationist and maintained high taxes and tariffs on imports. The idea was to remove these impediments, creating a so-called free trade environment and providing a foundation for future economic stability and growth. This emerging ideology of globalism meant that nations would eliminate barriers to trade, producing an overall increase in worldwide economic interdependence. This interdependence encourages international capital investment, opens new markets, and harmonizes regulations among nations to ensure fairness on the open market. Thus, a global economy is characterized by standardized trade practices, mutual growth, global investment, cooperation among nations instead of continuous trade war, and can assist underdeveloped countries, helping them achieve economic stability. Globalism is very frequently administered and promoted by international non-government institutions which have no sovereignty over any person or persons, that are entirely voluntary. The most frequently focused on, frequently mentioned non-governmental organization is, of course, the United Nations. The benefits of globalization, as mentioned previously, are standardized trade practices, mutual growth, foreign investors can provide capital, cooperation among nations instead of competition, encourages peace and discourages war, and, as mentioned, this may help underdeveloped countries achieve economic stability. Globalism is not without its faults, and there are significant potential pitfalls that must be addressed. The unelected international bodies tasked with enforcing trade regulations may infringe upon or undermine local and regional authority. The door is opened to the exploitation of economically vulnerable persons, resources, and nations. Aggressive privatization in pursuit of free trade can extend to essential goods and services such as utilities, infrastructure, education, and law enforcement, leaving a nation socially crippled by its own efforts at economic growth. One example, mentioned in previous sessions, may be the recent events in Argentina, where over-privatization produced complete economic chaos. Continued focus on fair trade practices has the potential to lower prosperous nations to the level of undeveloped countries rather than assist in development of those same undeveloped countries. Finally, globalism has become a stalking horse for those who promote crackpot conspiracy theories. The ideologies of protectionism and isolationism were well entrenched. How, then, could thousands of politicians all around the world be simultaneously persuaded to encourage trade with economic rivals and potential enemies in a consistent global, that is, domestic and international economic policy? Could companies, individuals, and industries perhaps make better economic decisions on their own? As early as 1946, there were industry-specific precedents already in existence, demonstrating that the practice of economic self-regulation through non-governmental institutions was much more effective than relying entirely on partisan politicians for economic leadership. This required the creation of international bodies for self-regulation, the aforementioned non-governmental organizations. An NGO has, as mentioned previously, no sovereign authority to govern. Membership is voluntary, as is compliance with whatever rules and regulations are promulgated by the relevant NGO. There are also NGOs that concentrate on other purposes rather than economic, and are only indirectly involved in the economic affairs of member nations. Perhaps the best-known international body of any kind, as mentioned previously, and arguably the most influential of NGOs, is the United Nations, or UN. Among many other functions, the UN provides a forum for nations to discuss trade issues without resorting to embargoes or military involvement. However, there are other important organizations devoted specifically to non-governing financial matters. These include the World Trade Organization, or WTO, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, commonly known as the World Bank. The World Trade Organization assists member nations in lowering barriers to international trade and in resolving international trade disputes. The IMF helps countries with runaway inflation stabilize their currencies, primarily through loans. The World Bank also makes loans to economically disadvantaged nations, but for purposes besides simply stabilizing the currency. These purposes often include industrial development and public works such as roads and other infrastructure. In exchange for soliciting the help of the international community, nations receiving aid through these organizations are expected to lower their trade barriers, such as taxes and tariffs, and liberalize, or frequently deregulate, their economies. For better or for worse, globalism is the emerging international economic system, and the process of forming a global economy, or globalization, is a fact that nations and businesses have to accept and reckon with as it emerges as the defining economic reality of our century. The trend towards globalization is not likely to change. Proponents maintain that any adverse effects will be slight and temporary, and as the worldwide economy becomes fully globalized, worldwide growth will be assured, and the nations of the world will take another step towards lasting peace and prosperity. The full impact and long-term effects of globalization have yet to be seen.